Lawson, Fite. He's the General Counsel for the American Forest Resource Council and comes to us today from Portland, Oregon. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Congresswoman Hanabusa, for inviting me to address the committee today. Very much appreciate the opportunity to speak to you about litigation and bureaucratic obstacles that are impeding restoration of our federal forests. The American Forest Resource Council, where I'm the General Counsel, represents the forest products industry in 5 western states: Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, and California. Our members' businesses and the rural communities those members' businesses support depend on a steady and predictable supply of timber. The forest products industry is often the only source of family wage jobs in those communities. These jobs are the linchpin of many rural communities throughout the West and throughout our country. My written testimony outlines a series of recommendations for addressing these litigation and bureaucratic obstacles. I'll summarize these in my opening statement, and throughout our discussion today, but I encourage the committee to consider all the recommendations. There's a substantial need today for responsible, science-based, active management throughout our federal forests. Our forests have become overgrown, unhealthy, and fire-prone due to the combined effects of a lack of management, and that includes decades upon decades of fire suppression, climate change, drought, and other extreme weather events. Our communities are suffering along with the landscape. A lack of wood supply leads to mill closures, job losses, and hollowing out of these rural communities. Unfortunately, litigation and bureaucratic delays are intensifying these crises. Now, not every forest management project gets litigated, but a lot depends on which projects get litigated and where they are. Right now, for example, the entire timber sale program of the Umpqua National Forest, based in Roseburg, Oregon, is in litigation and is not proceeding. There are a number of common sense reforms that we can make, and support for those reforms is growing. Litigation reform, unlike many of the problems that this body confronts, is one that lends itself to win-win solutions. We can streamline processes, we can eliminate duplicative or unnecessary paperwork, and we can do so without sacrificing the conservation benefits provided by our environmental laws, such as NEPA and the Endangered Species Act. At the same time, we can preserve the rights of the public, including environmental groups, to obtain review of projects by a neutral decision maker. That said, there are folks who might lose with litigation reform. It would not be a win for fringe or ideologically driven groups who oppose all active management simply for the sake of obstruction. Under the current legal and regulatory structure, these groups drive decision makings and outcomes that result because the management agencies cut back on their projects and their programs in order to avoid litigation. And they shift limited resources to projects in order to create perfect, bulletproof environmental documents. The public lands, the public process in our rural communities suffer as a consequence. Now, it may surprise you to learn that our legal program at AFRC is heavily involved in collaboration. In fact, I personally represent several collaborative groups in court. But I want to submit to the committee that collaboration is not a panacea. One of these projects that we are working on in Northwest Montana has the support of a strong collaborative group, including many environmental organizations, as well as timber companies and local governments. And that project is under an injunction right now from the Ninth Circuit. So litigation reform is a way that we can move forward and achieve the restoration that our forested landscape needs and that our rural communities need. I thank the committee for the opportunity to appear, and I look forward to our hearing today.
Mr. Fite, I want to talk about the serial litigation that goes on with these laws. Where are they getting their funding?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's hard to say as an outsider where groups are getting their funding. Certainly, a significant amount of funds are being expended in these fee awards under EJA and other statutes, EJA being the Equal Access to Justice Act. One study indicated in a one-year period approximately $6 million of taxpayer funds paid out. And so the taxpayers are basically hiring these litigants to litigate against the taxpayers. Yes, Mr. Chairman, and that's not the way EJA was designed to work. EJA was designed to allow people to attract competent counsel, but not to provide a windfall. And one of the reasons we believe that some EJA reform is necessary is that the current structure of EJA just is too much of an incentive for litigation, and it also makes getting a fee award in forestry litigation too easy, because you only win a case against the Forest Service if you show the action is arbitrary and capricious, and then you get fees if you show that it wasn't substantially justified. Well, how is something both arbitrary and capricious and substantially justified?
Well, even if they prevail on any points, they end up being reimbursed by taxpayers, correct?
Often they do, yes, sir.
So they could lose 99 points in a case, win one, and they've hit the jackpot.
That's right, Your Honor.
And this money is. Let me ask you one more thing real quick. There aren't very many environmental lawsuits. Well, what this subcommittee has learned in previous hearings is that the threat of litigation has paralyzed forest managers. Is that your observation?
Yes, the forests will focus on projects that they believe to be non-controversial, and it's a one-way ratchet. Basically, we'll do this technique because that's not controversial, but then one of those gets picked off, so and it continues to shrink.
Unfortunately, my time's expired.
Well, thank you. I'll be brief on this one as well. Mr. Fite, if I could ask you just two questions, and let's follow up on the litigation that has been brought up at the end of Chairman McClintock's questions and by Ms. Hanabusa. Because there is obviously a fine line between reality and pretend here. In reality, the Forest Service attempts, with a great deal of time and effort and expense, to bulletproof all of their EAs and EISs so they will not be litigated. But in doing so, the preparation time, the complexity of the documents increases significantly. Is it true, or is it possible, that in many instances, the increased complexity of these situations, the protracted review timelines, actually creates more opportunities for litigation?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, it does. And how it does so is it opens up new analyses that can be questioned and brought in front of a court, and new flaws that can be highlighted.
So we have this cycle that goes through that as the agency attempts to eliminate litigation against them, they actually open up new opportunities for increased litigation against them, which is why they have a frustration within the agencies of what this seems to be a never-ending cycle. Are there any reforms that can necessarily break this self-fulfilling cycle that would increase both regulatory review time and limit the delays due to litigation? How can we change the process to break this cycle?
There are a number of ways, Mr. Chairman. One way that can really help, and this is a procedural reform that would not undermine the conservation goals of these statutes, but clear direction from the Congress on when to use an environmental assessment and when to use an environmental impact statement would greatly reduce the defensive nature of these documents. And for example, an environmental assessment, we recently saw one that was 450 pages. In 1980, the Council on Environmental Quality said an environmental assessment should be 15 pages. That's just an example of the bloat of these bulletproof documents.
All right. Do you have anything else? I mean, another procedural
Oh.
approach we could come up with to try and change the cycle?
And try and change this cycle. Yes, absolutely. We can also cut down on the administrative appeal process, because what that ends up doing is giving serial litigants multiple bites at the apple. And it does so in a way that's not consistent with how those processes were designed. Those processes, I believe, were designed in order to fix errors and involve the public. But the Forest Service does a great job of involving the public. Sometimes they might even go a little overboard. And these processes, all they do is delay projects so that they can't be implemented in a timely fashion. And oftentimes, by the time they get implemented, a lot of the work has to be redone.
All right, I appreciate that very much. And Mr. Chairman, I think he's given us at least two good ideas that we could incorporate or need to incorporate somewhere into statute to try and break the chain of frivolous lawsuits and litigation that goes through there. And I will yield back my time.
And he's actually given us a lot of very good suggestions, which I know the staff is working into legislative proposals now, and I want to thank him.
Mr. Fite, you talked a lot about collaboration, and I appreciate that. Would this be a good example of that? Of your definition of collaboration?
It can be. You know, collaboration is a pretty broad word, and what I have noticed is that collaboration, it's not an end-all or a cure-all, because you have collaborative projects that still get litigated, and there are a number of groups on, and I'll be frank, at both ends of the spectrum, who reject that idea. So the litigation reforms that we believe are necessary will help make collaboration work where collaboration is possible. An additional issue with collaboration is that collaboration is working well in eastern Washington, to some extent in eastern Oregon, working well in Idaho and Montana.
Why?
In part because there is a different landscape and there's more consensus. But where things are more polarized and folks have the power that the current system gives them, then there is less collaboration and more litigation.
Give me an example of a place that's more polarized besides some places here in Washington, D.C.
Besides Washington, yes. Certainly Western Oregon is a good example of that. And
Why?
There is an attitude among some groups that believe that forests should not be managed, and it's an absolutist attitude, and it may be, in some respects, it may go back to past battles, but there are groups out there who don't want management for any reason, and they use the tools that they can to stop management, and they're just more prominent in Western Oregon. Congressman, if I may as well.
Yes.
There's a combination of factors that are contributing to the current forest health crisis. I want to focus on California, and we've had over 100 million trees die in California in the last several years. Now, that die-off was triggered by a drought episode, an exceptional drought episode, and the relation of that particular drought to climate change is unclear, but it certainly, climate change makes forests more vulnerable. But in addition, the lack of active management makes them less resilient to extreme events like the drought. So if our forests in California had active management for the last several decades, they would have been in a better position to respond to that drought event, to the recent insect and beetle epidemic, and we wouldn't be in danger, as we are in some places in the southern Sierras, of losing the forested landscape.
Mr. Fite, I would like to talk to you for a moment about the closure of mills like the Orofino Mill. How many mills have closed in the last 20 years?
I don't have the number at my fingertips, Congressman, but way too many have closed. I can tell you about Rough and Ready, which is another mill like Tripro. They were one of the only family wage employers in Cave Junction, Oregon. They're in the midst of a sea of federal timber, and they had to close last year, auctioned off their equipment because they could not get the timber supply from the federal forests that surround them.
So you would agree with the quote that it's not the lack of resources, that it's the litigation and other issues that's preventing these timber mills from working and being effective?
I would. There's certainly the timber on the landscape.
Once the mills close, what impact does that have on the Forest Service's ability to manage the forest?
It's devastating, Congressman, because when you have a private infrastructure in place, those mills will pay the Forest Service for the saw timber, and they will conduct the needed active management activity. They will also support the rural communities with family wage jobs. But if those mills go away, the Forest Service actually has to go out and hire contractors to do things that the industry would pay the Forest Service for the privilege of doing. And it greatly hamstrings the Forest Service's ability to do really necessary forest management activity.
So we're not only destroying jobs, but we're making it more expensive to manage the forest.
Exactly, exactly.
Do we have enough timber in the forest to support industry and local economies while at the same time protecting these ecosystems?
We do, and there are a lot of strategies and reforms that can be undertaken that keep both of those needs into account, providing sustainable timber supply for our rural communities, but also ensuring that ecological priorities are observed. Situation when you have groups who come in and use the tools, and their objective is simply obstruction, and that's why we favor a number of measures that are common sense litigation reforms. One of those being H.R. 1483 to fix the Cottonwood decision, which threatens to freeze a lot of forest management.
You bet. And just in closing, Mr. Chairman, those lawyers get $750 an hour to bring those lawsuits. It's reimbursed by the taxpayer, and so they're killing our rural jobs and getting a lot of money for it per hour. Yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Is the end game in these lawsuits, is it victory for those who bring them just to delay, and they really don't care about the outcome, as long as they can continue to delay our ability to move forward with good forest management procedures? Anybody can take that, or you can all can take it if you want.
If I may start, Congressman, certainly there are groups who oppose all active management in our federal forests, and that's their goal. And a delay now, you buy time, and then you can use another tool to delay more. Then maybe a survey has to get redone, or there's a change in personnel or something else. But delay is part of that tactic, and part of keeping the jobs there is making sure you have a predictable timber supply and steady. And so that delay itself can be extremely damaging, both to the industry and the infrastructure.
So if delay is really the end game of the lawsuit, knowing there's probably never going to be a victory and it creates more billable hours, if you will, what can Congress do?
Congress can do a lot of things. Congress can streamline the administrative end, and in a number of projects, particularly the Johnson Bar project that Congressman Labrador was referring to, there was an extremely long administrative process that really didn't change the project very much or bring up things that needed to be fixed. They didn't bring up the grounds that the project was later halted on, but it left the Forest Service flat-footed when it came to the litigation. So that's one thing we can do. Another thing we can do is with EJA, which ends up acting as an incentive for litigation in certain respects. There is a cap. It's inflation adjusted right now. It's $193 an hour, which is pretty close to market rate in a lot of these rural communities, frankly. And the Ninth Circuit in particular is very loose about going beyond that cap. And then you're at market rate for San Francisco or Portland or Seattle, and that's a tremendous amount of funds, and those funds actually come straight out of the agency budget. They don't come out of the Treasury. They come out of the Forest Service or BLM budget, and it's a vicious cycle that they end up in. So those are some modest reforms that the committee and Congress could look at.
Your discussion over sequestration really interested me. If you accept the premise that carbon dioxide is significantly affecting global warming, I would think that there would be several conclusions that would naturally follow. For example, if less water falls or less water can be stored as snow, doesn't that argue that we should be reducing forest density so vegetative levels can match the ability of the land to support them?
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman. And
Would it follow from that premise that we should harvest older trees that absorb little carbon dioxide in order to make room for younger trees that absorb large volumes of carbon dioxide?
it may. The goal with much restorations is ensuring you have the historic range of variability, which may require harvesting some larger trees and some smaller trees.
Younger trees do absorb a great deal more carbon than older trees, do they not?
Yes.
Would it follow then from that premise that we should salvage fire-killed timber rather than leave it to decay, which releases enormous amounts of carbon dioxide through outgassing?
That certainly would help the situation and help the landscape.
Are our current laws assisting or hindering these practices?
Hindering.
Final question, we were told regarding litigation that it's very moderate, the courts can reduce awards, they're limited. That's the theory, is that the practice?
Not in the Ninth Circuit, Mr. Chairman. And there's certainly more restraint in the DC Circuit, but not in the Ninth.
Gosar.
Mr. Fite, are you aware of any sweetheart deals that were cut with environmental groups under the Obama administration?
There are certainly some settlements that were cut. When we were talking about the Northwest Forest Plan issue, there was a settlement agreement that related to the critical habitat for the northern spotted owl that led to a greatly expanded critical habitat designation that we don't believe was based on sound science. And I would say with the Northwest Forest Plan, it was never implemented because only half the level of timber harvest that was promised by that plan was achieved. The ecological objectives may have been achieved, but the socioeconomic objectives were not achieved. And I will say we in the industry, we recognize that litigation can be a tool, and that's why we are favoring common sense litigation reforms that are supported by Democrats and Republicans that can ease the litigation burden without depriving citizens of the right of review.